Hey, I'm Ed Stetzer. Welcome to the New Churches. I don't know. What do we call this, Daniel? It's like the VOD. It's not a podcast. It's kind of a
Q&A webinar.
No, it's a vodcast.
A vodcast. I think people stopped saying that like 5 years ago.
Don't mock me. Don't mock me because you're a young whippersnapper who knows the hipster term.
Savage.
Savage. That's my middle schooler.
Yeah.
That's my middle schooler. In fact, I should show you. I'd have a picture. We went fishing and we caught some fish in the Amazon. But anyway,
was it easier to fish in the Amazon?
I don't know. It's just fishing is fishing. They're bigger, so
Okay.
but fishing was fishing. I didn't catch 100 fish,
Yeah.
so I don't think it was that much easier.
They didn't jump in your boat and hit you in the head?
Video. I wanted that video. I think that's illegal though, so I don't know. But anyway, all right. So we are here with the amazing Daniel Im, who's actually many of you may not know, but he's an accomplished author. Well, of course, everyone would know that because you were accomplished with planting missional churches.
Thanks to Ed Stetzer.
Well, I don't know about that, but we loved writing it together. It was a great project, and I got to see some of your writing moxie. That's a word you can Google a little later. I got to see some of your moxie, but he now has a standalone book with a foreword by none other than Tom Rainer, and it's called No Silver Bullets.
Yep.
5 small shifts. You can't say that 5 times fast, by the way. 5 small shifts that will transform your ministry. Okay, so let's jump right in. We got questions. People have questions that want to be answered. So let's talk about it. What are the best ways to communicate disciple making as opposed to discipleship in terms of like system and structure?
Yeah, in the book, the big thing here is the book is about discipleship from a systems perspective, right? So regardless of if you're a mega or multi-site or small or house church or rural or attractional, missional, whatever model you have.
List every way people have done church in the last 30 years. But anyway,
regardless of how that is, I really wanted to take a look at discipleship from a systems perspective, right? So if we really went out like 50,000 foot level, how is it that we disciple? So one of the things in regards to that question is we often disciple the way that we've been discipled, right? Unless we consciously do otherwise. It's like we parent the way we've been parented. We teach the way that we've been taught. So in light of that, when, the question is, what are the best ways to communicate disciple making? Part of it is, hey, first of all, how do you disciple and how do you view discipleship? I love this quote by Sun Tzu, The Art of War. And it's my paraphrase of his quote, but it's like, if you know your enemy, you're going to win half the time. But if you know yourself, you'll win the other half, right? And in order to become a disciple maker, you really need to look at that first half and see, okay, how is it that I view discipleship?
Do you quote Sun Tzu a lot in the book?
Once. That's honestly my favorite quote. Like, I love that.
You actually might not want to paraphrase it. It is, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat.
Yeah.
If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. So if it's your favorite quote, which is one of my favorite quotes, I would exhort you actually to memorize that quote. But
I think the paraphrase is a little bit more tangible to understand than that.
It probably is. All right. How do you manage the tension between discipleship as organic and discipleship as intentionally structured? I've often said for church planners, organic basically means we didn't plan it, so we're going to call it organic. So how do you manage that tension?
So there's this quadrant, this matrix that I have in the first chapter. And on the one side, you have destination and direction. And if you think about a spectrum of how discipleship happens, there are individuals on the one side that say, hey, no, discipleship is about getting to a certain destination. Or, if you remember, it's the whole bounded centered set idea from missiology, Paul Hebert. So Paul Hebert really initially talked about it in the sense of Christian conversion. But I wanted to take that concept and say, okay, what does it look like from a discipleship standpoint? So on the one hand, you have a destination-focused individual that's saying, oh yeah, I see discipleship as doing these classes or having these certain marks, and then you're discipled. But on the other hand, you have discipleship as being directional, right? So you're thinking, hey, Eugene Peterson, it's a long obedience in the same direction, or you're talking about Philippians or Hebrews 12, and it's running the race of faith with perseverance. And honestly, Ed, if we were to ask any of our Plus members or any pastors, hey, how do you view the process of discipleship? Most will verbally say, oh, obviously it's running the race of faith with perseverance. It's directional. right? And most of us will verbally say that, but because we often disciple the way that we've been discipled, oftentimes we don't view someone as being discipled unless they get through those certain marks. So functionally, we believe it's destination, but verbally we'll say it's directional. So on the one hand, you have that, but on the other hand, you have this idea of organizational accountability. So as a church leader, as a pastor, if you say you're going to do something, are you actually going to do it? Right? Or if you introduce this new model or way of doing stuff, do you actually stick with it? Or do you read another book or go to another conference and do you switch it? Right? So if you were to put both of those spectrums together, you have 4 personas of a church. And when it comes to the question of how do you manage the tension between discipleship as organic and intentionally structured, you have this idea of copycat churches versus hippie churches. Right. And
Hippy. Okay. I hadn't thought of that, but okay.
Yeah. So the copycat church they're both very, on the accountability side, the organizational accountability side, they're both low. So they're going to be switching things very often. So the copycat church sees discipleship as getting to getting certain marks, doing certain things, and they're often copying one church's model to the next, and they keep on switching it because of that low accountability. Now, the hippie church, or other people call it the organic church, or the church where it's, and you got to do it with his voice, right? You just do what works for you, and, just read the Bible, and that's going to make everything better, or just preach. You just got to preach. And if you preach, then everything else is going to figure itself out. Right? It's this idea of, because it's a long obedience in the same direction. And they love quoting that quote.
Wow.
But it's
You're not dismissing that quote, because that would hurt my feelings a lot.
No, that also applies to churches of high accountability.
Just checking.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting about that whole thing is hippie churches, right?
I really think that all the organic church people are offended by every word that's coming out of your mouth right now. But keep going, because maybe they won't watch this. We can only hope that they won't watch this.
All right. I mean, the whole idea is, how do you actually move from that side where you're seeing it as being as just saying, hey, everyone has their own path and you got to draw nearer to Christ the way that you need to draw nearer to Christ. How do you actually take this mindset of, yes, discipleship is running the race of faith. Discipleship is directional. Discipleship is a long obedience in the same direction. But how do you actually add a higher sense of organizational accountability onto that? Right? How do you actually move it? So you're not changing the way you view discipleship, but you're actually adding more intentionality or structure or systems onto that. So that's where I say, hey, you need to actually move from hippie to intentional, right? So if you're thinking boundaries, right? How do you actually, if you have a moving sidewalk, right? Instead of saying, hey, here's the airport, there's so many different terminals. You just got to figure out how to go from here to there. Instead of that, what if you actually had a moving sidewalk and said, hey, no, stay here. We're going to help you move towards that place. If you want to jump off, you can jump off. But here's actually the way that we're going to encourage you to move towards that. That's just, a quick little analogy.
Okay. No, yeah. And actually, with the exception of the hippie church reference, is actually pretty helpful. What are the best ways to communicate a longer discipleship process in a more unchurched culture? To maybe a more lostness around us than in a population of already evangelized people. Yeah, you can do this for partner churches and more. So how do you do that?
Yeah, one of the things when we think of discipleship, or when a church leader or a pastor thinks about, hey, we need to disciple. Right, Matthew 28, 18 to 20. You make great. You need to make disciples of all nations. Yes, we got to do that. So how are we going to do it? Well, let's look at curriculum, or let's see what that church is doing, right? And we often equate discipleship with small group material, right? Or we equate discipleship with a program or with Sunday school, or we always equate it with something the church does. Right. But in order to properly understand and help people understand, hey, the goal of your discipleship pathway is not just to make sure that the church offers this, but it's actually about creating self-feeders, right? So yes, as a church, you need to have on-ramps, you need to have first steps, you need to have next steps, you need to have all that. But the goal is to create this sense of ongoing steps that it's where the individual, where every church member, whether you're brand new, whether you're unchurched or churched, already evangelized or not, where it's moving the ownership of discipleship to the individual rather than as this consumeristic model of, hey, you just need to go to church and that's how you're going to get discipled. So it's that self-feeding aspect, right? We talked about it on the podcast. I think the one that released this week.
Yeah, and always a key thing. I mean, the whole where that comes into the self-feeding thing becomes key. All right. So should you require anyone who desires to become a member to take part in discipleship system or pathway? If so, how strong should you be in requiring new members to become part of a discipleship system or a pathway? And this is just a tricky one. A lot of people, they don't feel they have the ecclesiological permission to require things beyond, say, a church covenant. So.
Yeah, I mean, even you think about church discipline, right? Right, and it's like, hey, that's. Are you going to
discipline people for not going through the discipleship pathway? Like discipline you did not. I mean, you could. I mean, I'd imagine there are churches that do that.
Yeah,
I think some of them might be a little spooky, but,
and probably small.
That's true. But there is a sense. I mean, I actually wrote my D-Min dissertation on creating a cultural pressure towards participating in discipleship pathways. So I'm really passionate about this. But how do you do that? How do you require it? Do you require it? What does it look like?
Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit of your thoughts, and then I'll get into my answer.
Thoughts? I'm interviewing you.
No, I know, but the you piqued my curiosity when you talked about the cultural aspect.
So what we did is I wrote a whole dissertation on this before I did the PhD. I did a D-Min, and I talked some about how to persuade people. There's actually theorists on persuade. So I wanted to persuade a congregation to put a higher value on participating in a discipleship pathway, and actually walk through the process of doing that. It took a 1-year process to change the culture to non-participation to participation, and it worked. We lost 2 families who just felt the ongoing cultural pressure and didn't feel comfortable anymore, and we doubled the size of our church. Well, actually, so here's the weird number. So we were about 125 when we started this.
Okay.
Lost 2 families, so we're down, 115. But we grew to maybe 225 or 250. What was interesting, though, was the next 100 plus people looked like the culture we created.
Okay, yep.
And so all of a sudden the culture shifted. So not everyone made the shift. So we did require to be a member, we had certain membership requirements. You had to go through 4 classes. I think in terms of baseball diamond saddleback-ish, very similar to what everyone's familiar with, 4 core courses. And that was a part of the discipleship pathway. But then we began to see the culture shift and people participate. So we required it for membership. We required small group participation for membership in the covenant, and that was our ongoing discipleship strategy. So now, I shouldn't be answering your questions. You answer the questions I ask you.
Well, I love that. And what's interesting here, when it comes to discipleship pathway and the unique way that I articulate it here, is just the whole idea of, hey, what if you actually view your discipleship pathway, right, not as a system of 101 to 401 or classes you need to take, because that kind of propagates the destination mindset of discipleship. I mean, you could still have 101 to 401.
You're talking down what I did then.
No. I'm saying you can still have 101 to 401, but what do you...
If you want to, but why would you want to is what you're saying. But go ahead.
No, I'm saying oftentimes that is what we equate the discipleship pathway to be, when actually it's a lot broader than that.
Okay. So talk to me about how broad it is. What does it look like?
Okay. So ongoing steps, first steps, and next steps. Okay. When it comes to the ongoing steps of a discipleship pathway, it's this whole idea of ongoing steps never end. So I remember there are 2 things that stick out to me about doing systematic theology in seminary. And it is this one class I took with J.I. Packer. Other than the doxology being sung at every the start of every class, and you got this, great British tone of the doxology, he said this. He was like, your relationship with Christ is like you're moving up an ever spiraling tower where you hit Christology, pneumatology, soteriology, ecclesiology. You just go through, and then the next time you go through Christology again, it's different. It means something different because everything speaks into. So the whole idea of, hey, they never end, right? So discipleship is not about going through a set of classes and receiving a certificate, sharing your testimony, getting baptized, and then becoming an usher, right? I mean, like disciples, it's not about creating widgets. We can't mass produce disciples on an assembly line because you never arrive. So and you're going to like this, Ed. When you were at Lifeway Research, and I like saying Lifeway Research a lot. I don't say that an angel gets their wings every time. I know that's your thing. Yeah. So, and I know Scott McConnell doesn't say it.
No, it's just my joke.
Yeah, it is your joke. So we'll let that rest in peace.
Exactly. Let it rest in peace. Wow. That seems like you're saying it anyway. Let's move on.
Yeah. Okay. But you were at Lifeway Research, and you headed up the Transformational Discipleship Assessment, right? And you were part of that. And what was really neat about the TDA, and it's been around obviously for many years now, is the beauty of the 8 attributes.
Yeah.
Right. The clarity of the 8 attributes, which is just amazing. Now, when I was writing this book and I was trying to figure out, hey, how can we bring a little bit, I mean, even if you look at the 8 attributes, it's still complex. No matter how beautifully you craft it and write it out and present it, it's still 8 things. Like it's, so I went to Scott and Lizette and I was like, hey, does the 80-20 principle work here? And I know you're fully aware of all this research here, but for our Plus members, I was like, hey, are there 1 or 2 things, or are there things that we can do that'll actually lift all 8, right? Things that we can actually encourage our congregation towards. So the big ones that came out, obviously, were reading the Bible, right? Not studying or memorizing. They both influenced, but just the simple act of reading the Bible actually lifted all of that, right? A participation in a small group, worship service attendance, and serving. Right? Those are kind of those 4 big things that individuals could do that you could help your church do that's going to actually lift all 8 and help individuals grow in maturity. So around those 4, what I designed with the ongoing steps is, hey, what if actually you helped all of your church members to adopt those 4 as things that they could do, that those were the ongoing steps that they could all own, right? Regardless of whether they went to a big church or a small church, multi-site or a church plant. These were ongoing steps that it's the whole idea of creating and cultivating those self-feeders, right? And then, so that includes, so you're actually being discipled and you're actually on the discipleship pathway if all you're doing is attending a weekend service. Mm-hmm. Right. And now, obviously, we don't want people to end there, but that is one of those aspects. So then what brings people into the church are your first steps, right? Maybe it's your newcomers class or alpha or starting point or whatever those things that you're going to engage the unchurched and those are the onboarding ramps. But ultimately, you want people to be living out those input goals that result in the 8 output goals of the 8 attributes. And then you have the ongoing, the next steps, like maybe it's a seminar event. There's tons of research that came out with the Billy Graham Center of Evangelism and Lifeway Research, all the evangelism stuff, right? And it's like maybe it's talking more about that or helping people grow in their understanding of how to evangelize. It's a seminar, or it's a class here or there, but ultimately it's bringing people always back to becoming a self-feeder, those ongoing steps.
Makes sense. Okay, good. Can I tell you a little shorter answers?
Yes, I'm sorry. It was just
a little shorter. You got a lot of words. This is why people wonder, why do you always interrupt Daniel M on the podcast? This is why.
Yeah, I'm long, I'm boring, I have lots of words.
Very controlling and
controlling.
Exactly.
You're the one who said I'm controlling.
Oh, wait, are you implying?
No, I'm just clarifying. Are you the one that just said I was controlling?
I did say those words.
Okay,
Number
thank you.
5 on our list. How can the local church develop appropriate empowerment of non-pastors, what some people call the laity, take ownership of the discipleship of people they lead to Jesus rather than sort of seeing it as the church's job?
Yeah, I think in order to help the local church, non-pastors, to really own it, to really understand it, I think that comes through clarity, right? And there's so many ways that we can, and a lot of people have written about vision, strategy, mission, values, and I mean, our friend Will Mancini, most people know him as kind of being the vision guy.
He's not my friend.
He's not your friend, okay. Right, but then Peter Drucker has his 5 questions, Patrick Lencioni and The Advantage. I mean, there's a lot of people that have written on this, and frankly, just to be completely honest, personally, I really want things to be even more simple than what is, right? And while I was thinking through that and wrestling through all the material that is out there, I was like, okay, what if actually we looked at what a church does as vision, strategy, and values, right? Vision being the great contextualized version of the Great Commission and Great Commandment, right? Like, no matter, I don't care how you word it or if you want to call it mission or whatnot, but it's that where are you moving towards? And then the strategy is everything a church does. And as I was looking deeper into this, a church's strategy is really a combination of two strands: your discipleship pathway and your leadership pipeline. Right? On the one hand, you're equipping the saints for the work of ministry. On the other hand, you're maturing people towards Christ. But honestly, even if you look at kids ministry, membership class, evangelism, everything a church does really fits under that, either your discipleship pathway or your leadership pipeline, your strategy. And what differentiates your church from the one down the road are your values, right? Your culture. So when it comes to, and you mentioned this earlier, right, about the whole idea of how do you really shape that culture, and it really is that culture of ownership, right? It's that culture of ownership, and in order to actually articulate and help individuals own discipleship, you really need to actually articulate that at the values level, right? Not just like, hey, here's on our website, these are the we're gospel centered, spirit filled, and Bible believing. Mm-hmm. Right. And you're like, well, that really doesn't differentiate many churches from other churches. Right. It's just kind of one of those things. Those should actually be on your statement of faith in some form or fashion. Your values should actually be, hey, maybe it's like, so the church that I'm a teaching pastor at, I'm helping our church craft our values. And one of the values is round table leadership. Right. As you know, Ed, there's no senior pastor at our church. We have 2 campus pastors. It's elder-led, plurality of elders. I'm one of the teaching pastors. And it's just roundtable leadership is one of those things where it's like, yeah, that actually at every level, that is what differentiates our church from the ones down the road. So if you really want to help everyone, discipleship is such a core concept, and it should be for every church, but how can you actually articulate that in a unique way? Like Soma, for example. Right, they have their rhythms, and eating is one of their rhythms, right? So how can, if that's one of those things that you're like, hey, that eating is so important as it relates to discipleship, make that one of your values, right? And that's how you kind of move towards the ownership at that value level.
Right. Okay. All right. So what about how do you incorporate your pathway into existing like life groups, which we call them in our church life groups, a small group, Sunday school classes? How do you merge those systems?
Yeah, it really goes back to that idea of, hey, discipleship pathway, your discipleship pathway is actually larger than your small groups. It's not something that, because I've met and talked to many churches that believe, hey, life groups are one thing, your discipleship pathway are your set of 4 classes you need to do to kind of join the church, or 4 classes that every person needs to do, and then you join a small group and you're a part of you're just normal now. Right? So instead of seeing your pathway as being a set of classes, that's where it's really, hey, how do you actually see your discipleship pathway as the entirety of maturing people towards Christ? Ranging from everywhere from people going on mission trips to serving, to worship, to groups as well.
That makes sense. And has that, have you seen that work? Have you seen, obviously you must have. What are some examples where you've seen churches do this? Yeah,
so that's where it's not as much of a public, hey everyone, our discipleship pathway is everything. You're all on the discipleship pathway. So just choose whatever you want. It's not even really presenting it that way, but it's presenting it from the backset of, okay, as a staff team or as a pastor, when we look at how discipleship happens, what if we actually had a chart? And this is what I do on your preaching calendar, on your curriculum that you use, on all the things, you actually have the 8 attributes of the transformational discipleship assessment all there. And you're like, hey, if this is what maturity looks like, in my yearly sermon calendar, am I hitting these 8 attributes in some form or fashion? In this curriculum, are we hitting these attributes in some form or fashion? When we worship, what are those attributes that we are hitting as we even do those 1-minute call to worships or call to prayer on Sunday, and everything that we do, how do we actually see this entire thing? So it's not really a matter of, when you communicate it, you still communicate it as, hey, join a life group or take this class, or you can do it the way you want to do it, but it's more from that systems perspective. Yeah. Is that?
It does. It helps. Talk to me about the kind of the, how do you define, how important is it to define kind of what you want, the results you're looking for, and also the system and pathway itself? How do you make that available? How do you communicate that? Do people in the church know that there's this intentional pathway, or tell me about the communication strategy there?
Yeah. So going back to ongoing steps, first steps, and next steps, right? So when it comes to communication, you can actually print it as something like an ongoing steps, first steps, or next steps, or you have it where in the worship. So here's an example. In a worship service, the welcoming is happening, or you're having specific times where the campus pastor or pastor is coming up and they're welcoming and they're doing their announcements, right? Then the way that you kind of do this is you say, hey, if you're a brand new person here, if this is one of your first Sundays worshiping with us, then I want to talk to you. I want you to come to this get together right after the service. So you're targeting and you're saying, hey, if you're brand new, these are your first steps, right? These are your first steps. So it's highly targeted messaging in a bulletin announcement on the website. And then you can say, hey, if you've been a part of our church family for a long time, I want to invite you to this, or I want to encourage you to do this. And then when it comes to preaching or in any languaging, it's saying, hey, as we're all on this journey of faith, let me share with you how I read, what I read this week in the scriptures. So cultivating, really, really normalizing this language of becoming a self-feeder when it comes to the ongoing steps. So that's where, the whole book is saying, hey, you could have a 101 to 401 approach. You can have small groups or missional communities, but it's this intentionality of the communication. Because you and I, Ed, you're like the king of multitasking. All right. And I love it when you're speaking and I text you, because you will text back while you are speaking.
Not like a long text.
No, but you can read it and actually like you can actually text back and it makes sense. If I try to do that, I text what I'm saying right now.
I'm texting you right now. I'm going to say stop it right now, and everyone can say stop it. Okay, I got it. Is that too subtle?
No, but what I love about that is it's a perfect illustration of there's just so much information.
Yeah,
right. There's so much, and how do we filter? We've conditioned our brains to tune in and tune out. Right. Because we're always connected. So when it comes to, I see your text message, it is stop it.
Yes, I told you, stop it or I'll bury you in a box. So,
right.
Anyway.
So when it comes to messaging your discipleship pathway, right, how do we get better as leaders in messaging and saying, hey, if you're new, this is what it is. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so what about this? One of the things that first time I ever saw to do this, it was really super helpful, is the idea of the flipped classroom approach, kind of away from the sage on the stage, which for the record, as someone who likes to be the sage on the stage, it's kind of hard for me, but how do you have the look of being
I do. Just want to go with that. All right, so talk to us about the flip in the classroom dealio.
Yeah, so that's the whole idea of moving from the sage on the stage to a guide on the side. Right. Yeah. So it's the whole idea of, hey, we often will teach the way that we've been taught, unless consciously we do so otherwise. So a lot of the way that classes and seminars and volunteer development and training happens in churches is, unfortunately, it's influenced highly by how we were taught as children. Right. And it's the blackboard, or maybe it's the green or the whiteboard, or however it was. But it was often this sage on the stage, teach the lesson, go home and do your homework. Well, unfortunately, that's not how people learn today. Even as we talked about in our previous question, there's just so much information, right? There's so much going on all the time that in light of all that, how do we actually engage and captivate and bring about towards life transformation, right? So the whole idea of moving from being a sage to a guide, the idea of moving from that is saying, okay, how can we actually help people where they're at and help them remember and implement and retain all that we want them to learn in the evangelism class, right? In this class or that. So for example, if you're training volunteers, right? You're training volunteers, typically you have you do a Saturday morning, or you do once a semester a breakfast, or a Wednesday night, or a Sunday night, and you never get 100%. We never can get 100% of our volunteers out.
Sure.
Right. But typically if they do come, teach, maybe have a little bit of a discussion, bad coffee, maybe some donuts, pray, and then you're done. Right. If you were to turn that into a flipped classroom approach, you would give them a video first, right? Maybe it's a 5-10 minute video, that they understand. So even though, regardless, 100% are not going to come out, but everyone's going to get the core lesson. Because a 45-minute talk can be a 10-minute video super easily, right? 45-minute live talk. Because, we tell stories and all that, but a video, you can be really concise. All right. What, Ed?
Sorry, you're just destroying all the gospel-centered preaching that I do.
No, I'm not talking about preaching. I'm not talking about preaching.
I'm talking about training. Here's fair.
Yeah, preaching is different.
I totally get it. I think you're right. I think it can increase drastically. And, we talk about being self-feeding. I mean, this is in a sense where you're self-training.
Yeah. So let's say the video, so everyone gets trained, everyone gets developed through that 10-minute video or whatnot. And then when everyone comes together, you're then doing more adult education-oriented exercises, case studies, working through concepts, actually doing more interactive exercises so that it's, it moves towards retention and implementation. So it's the whole idea of flipping.
Okay, good. All right. So how do we create a model that's sustainable, continues to grow, duplicate, create new disciples? It seems a lot get going for a while and then sort of don't make it or make last or whatever, or a thing on the calendar people got to do.
Yeah, I want to go back to the transformational discipleship research, right? The regression analysis, right? When I was looking through that, the thing that really stuck out to me was the whole idea of, hey, you could actually simplify what it looks like to mature and to draw closer to Christ. Because we like to make it complicated. I mean, Pharisees, right? I mean, there's so many. Like Larry Osborne wrote a great book on that, right? Accidental Pharisees. It's this whole idea of, hey, we actually kind of like it. We like being the expert, right? We like kind of doing that. But how do you actually make the process of maturing towards Christ sustainable, simple, easy? And that's what I love about the whole idea of just that what came out in the research. If someone read their Bible on a monthly basis to someone who did it on a daily basis, I mean, it lifted all the 8 attributes significantly. So, personal story, a few weeks ago, there was a guy in my life group who we'd met for coffee on and off here and there, and we're trying to help their family. And he's been going through rough spots here and there, but he phoned me up a few weeks ago and he was like, "Hey, Daniel, I just want to ask you a couple questions." And he was just kind of stuttering and trying to get to a point. And at the end of it, I was like, are you asking me to disciple you? And he's like, yes, that is what I'm asking. And I'm like, great. Every Friday morning, 6 a.m., we're going to meet at Starbucks. It's on my calendar, recurring. And you're going to read the Bible. Right. And he had heard me preach about this, because I serve as a teaching pastor in my church. He had heard me preach about the importance of just scripture reading and how that affects maturity. And I was like, you're going to read the Bible. Every day you're going to read a psalm, and then you're going to read a couple chapters either from the Old Testament or New Testament. And then every Friday we get together, we're going to talk about it, and we're going to wrestle through it. And every Friday we've met, it's been so neat to see how he's becoming a self-feeder, and I'm just being that sounding board and helping him stay on track as he develops that.
Makes sense. Okay. So what about getting the leaders themselves to move towards a systems approach or more agile? What does that ultimately look like? How do you help them see the need to read your book, which we haven't mentioned? You got to mention the name of the book in all your answers if you want to do this right. You usually do that. Hold up the book.
Yeah, I do. I will hold up the book. No silver bullets.
No silver bullets. So are you against werewolves? Is that what this book is about? So, do you know silver bullets are what kills werewolves? Isn't that right?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So let's talk about werewolves.
Yes, let us definitely talk about werewolves and the zombie apocalypse.
Well, the zombie apocalypse is coming. You mock it, but it's inevitable. All right,
and for everyone who does not listen to our podcast, you need to listen to our podcast to get that.
It's kind of a regular theme of our. I read a guy from Hobart in Tasmania in Australia tweet that. Learned a fascinating thing. There's on the newchurch.com podcast this week, the zombie apocalypse is inevitable. But anyway, so back to their question though. How do you help people to move towards a systems approach?
Yeah, it's coming to, okay, so I love this. Simple Church, right? Eric Geiger, Dr. Tom Rayner, actually.
Dr. Eric Geiger.
Yeah, Dr. Ed Stetzer.
If you wouldn't mind calling me Dr. Stetzer.
Yes, Dr. Stetzer. Dr. Stetzer.
So don't judge me.
So there's this Sam Rainer, who is Dr. Tom Rainer's son, who's now actually a doctor as well. He was talking about the whole idea of doctor. He was talking about this whole idea of simple church, and I love this. It was in a podcast he was in with Marty Duran, and he was like, "Hey, a lot of people have misunderstood that book to say everything should be simple." Right. And what he was really getting at was, yes, it should be simple to the church, but simple church is actually complex to the staff. And that piqued my curiosity. I dug a little bit deeper into that, and I was like, you're right. I mean, even when it comes to the way that I encourage, so in the second half of the book, I talk about introducing change, vision, strategy, and values, and then your discipleship pathway. The whole second half of the book is based, it intends on tying together the 5 micro shifts in the first side so that you can actually then implement that into a discipleship pathway. So when it comes to systems and implementing, let's just say the 8 output goals, right? Or the input goals that lead people towards maturity, how do you actually then use that to audit all your curriculum? How do you use that to audit your preaching calendar? Especially if you're not preaching through books of the Bible and you're more topical, right? It's if you put just those 8 attributes, right, just as a matrix on all your sermon series, it's going to help you, especially if you're more topical. Even if you're book by book as well, or verse by verse, it's still going to help you understand, hey, this is what maturity looks like. Let's make sure we're hitting all of these topics so we're not overemphasizing one, emphasizing one over the other. Right. So it's that idea of looking at it from that system side. And then, here's another thing, what are you going to stop, start, and refine? Right? How are you going to actually do that for every aspect of your church? Maybe it's this: for everything that you start, what are 3 things that you can stop? Right? What is one thing that you can refine? Because it's so much easier to start than stop.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Right. So that's the whole idea from the systems approach, saying, okay, there are these principles in place. There's this research we can leverage. So as a church leader, hey, take advantage of these audits and assessments in the book. And make it really simple for your church so that they can become self-feeders.
Makes sense. All right. So last question. The book, which is could you hold it up in case people didn't see it earlier? It's No Silver Bullets by Daniel M. Forward by Dr. Tom Rainer, or as people who don't know him sometimes call him Thom Rainier, but it's actually Tom Rainer.
Have you really heard someone say Thom Rainier?
All the time. People come up to me and they want to be, hey, you work for Thom Rainier? And I'm like, yes, I do. He tells me, that's a joke he tells all the time. People who don't know him, because it's an odd spelling.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what, at the end of the day, if people apply this, what will their church look like that's different than the way it is now?
Yeah, it's going to be more, you're going to be taking small steps to large change. Right. So it's this idea of, hey, one thing is not going to change everything overnight, but there are these 5 micro shifts that if you make, you're going to be on the trajectory towards greater health and greater maturity, right? And growth, whether it's spiritual or numerical. But it's this idea of, hey, even honestly, Ed, when I look at the dedication of the book, I said to pastors and church leaders everywhere, you are the true heroes. Thanks for sticking with it. Let's finish well. And there's so many stories, it seems like it's daily or weekly of church pastors just flaming out, I just, that it breaks my heart. And my hope and my prayer is that we can create environments where not only the pastor is coming before the Lord in humility, being faithful in the little, whatever that little is, but creating this context and this culture in their church for us to all finish well.
Yeah, it's good. I'm Matt Stetzer with Daniel M. The book is No Silver Bullets. Thanks for joining us on the vodcast.
Not the vodcast.
The vodcast. Peace, everybody. Thanks.